Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you also to the IFLA organizing committee, in particular, Professor Zhou, for the invitation. We are very humbled to be here in Guangzhou. As we are gathering here on the third day of the World Congress, we wanted to reflect on our practice in a global context and pose a few questions about the way we practice. This provocation is informed by our observation in writing and producing the Big Asian Book of Landscape Architecture. Landscape architecture is an inherently cultural practice. Yet over the past decades, we have observed the trend of homogenization and loss of identity. Writing in 2020, the late Japanese landscape architect and immediate past president of IFLA APR, Fumiaki Takano, commented on the homogenization of design that has accompanied the growth of the profession. Gone is the cultural uniqueness of practice, with Takano observing that many young designers in Asia are growing up with the scent of Western-style landscapes. Damien Holmes, editor of World Landscape, shares Takano's views, stating earlier this year that while landscape architecture has grown in status internationally, it has also led to the convergence in design approaches. Design has become a toolkit applied across the world with little reference to context or culture. So what has happened to landscape architecture? How has such a culturally and site-specific practice been reduced to homogenized outcomes? Some might point to the forces of globalization, blaming client government demands for prescribed design outcomes and products. But we suggest that this situation is possibly of our own making. We argue that the profession's growth globally, guided by shared standards for education, policy, and practice, has occurred in the absence of a critical reflection on cultural differences, particularly those related to modernity. For example, Asia's transformation through processes of modernity and modernization represents a complex intertwining of continuity and interruption. Many Asian cultures have maintained an interconnectedness between nature and humans, which provides the foundation for consistencies of actions, relationships, and thoughts, independent from dynamic political and economic shifts. Within this context, century-old cultural practices of agriculture, garden design, and philosophical understandings of the natural world butt up against the 21st century idea of the landscape profession, underpinned by conceptual knowledge and values of the West. This impact is well demonstrated in the case of Japan, where we have multiple words to describe the term landscape. Let's look at the three words keishiki, huke, and keikan that are used to describe culturally driven ideas of landscape. Keishiki is the indigenous word, using the characters for scenery and color. With Buddhism's arrival in Japan, the first term fuke was introduced as a Buddhist impression of the world. Written in the Chinese characters for wind and scenery, fuke was adopted within literature and the arts as reference to the perceptible environment. In the contemporary Japanese language, however, fuke is used interchangeably with the older word keishiki. But there are subtle semantic distinctions between these terms. While keishiki is considered original Japanese, fuke is accepted as a word of foreign origin, Chinese origin in this case. Hence, fuke was considered suitable for translating the Western word landscape. With Japan's opening to the world during the Meiji Restoration from 1868, European scientific concepts from the natural science and engineering were brought to the country, and the German word Landschaft was interpreted into a new Japanese term, keikan, using the Chinese characters for scenery and appearance. Some consider Keikan a more objective focus of the environment associated with civil engineering, while Fuke reflects a more subjective understanding of the landscape. However, there is far more fluidity in these terms than much English translation suggests. In a further complexity, the term landscape was introduced as a loan word, meaning a word adopted from a foreign language with little or no modification, as reflected in Japanese katakana writing landscape. The loan word is used today to describe the landscape architecture profession through JLAO, the Japanese Landscape Architecture Union, or Landscape Architect Renmei, which is also overseeing the professional registration process. This is not to be confused with JILA, the Japanese Institute of Landscape Architects, the Nihon Zoen Gakkai, which refers to the term zoen for landscaping, using the characters for construction and garden. Despite landscape and architecture not widely understood by Japanese people, it was seen as an appropriate term to differentiate contemporary landscape architectural practice from traditional garden design. In addition, it aligned the definition of landscape in Japanese practice with the European Landscape Convention, which, not surprisingly, misses the subtle nuances and cultural connotations embedded in the traditional landscape readings. This thematic challenge, of course, is by no means unique to Japan. Similar complexity arises with the introduction of other spatial terms aligned with Western concepts of landscape architecture and urban design, such as private, public, and space. For instance, in many parts of the world, there is no concept of public space. In this way, the professional growth of landscape architecture acts as a homogenizing force, shaped by a concept of modernity which positions the development of the West as a reference point to guide the political, economic, and cultural developments of countries. Writing in 2000, the Israeli sociologist Shmuel Eisenstadt called for the adoption of multiple modernities as a more appropriate framing for understanding the contemporary world. He explains that while non-Western contexts have taken on some aspects of modernity, they've also rejected many, which has led to diverse transformations. These transformations, in Eisenstadt's word, are shaped in each society by the combined impact of their respective historical traditions and the different ways in which they become incorporated into the modern world system. It is this recognition of diversity and difference which is currently missing in the professional framing of landscape architecture, driven by organizations such as IFLA, national bodies, and university programs. At this moment, landscape architecture is positioned in a particular instrumental framing, which emphasizes regional problem solving. This is reflected in IFLA's professional definition based on the principles outlined by the International Standard Classification of Occupations, the ISCO, which we have already heard some of the discussions on day 1 and 2. With a focus on ecology, large-scale landscape planning and science, this description diminishes more design-oriented activities such as garden design, small-scale urban interventions, art practice, and the design of parks. This emphasis has introduced major tensions in the Chinese and Japanese context, where the proud cultural lineage of garden design is challenged by the professional definition of landscape architecture. But even within the Western context, the current IFLA definition has attracted some criticism. For example, the Federal Chamber of German Architects, the BAK, the governing body of the spatial design professions in Germany, which includes landscape architecture, acknowledges the significance of IFLA's definition as currently the only binding definition worldwide. However, the BAK explicitly challenged the failure of this definition to recognize all scales of spatial design, gardens, parks, and urban spaces that are embedded in the German professional classification, along with this asymmetric weighting towards large-scale planning with ecological and resource-related perspectives. The issue, therefore, is not whether landscape architecture should be addressing contemporary pressing issues such as climate change. The issue is, instead, the current emphasis on particular ways of conceptualizing methods and ways of working, which are also encouraging the application of standardized solutions tools. This framing is reinforced by professional award categories that uncritically restrict the way that we might understand knowledge emerging in practice. For example, designers are often encouraged to describe their approaches through generalized categories of topology and scale, which diminish the recognition of more culturally specific influences. Our recent experience judging the IFLA Student Awards was particularly challenging given the work looked so similar, driven through the rational scientific lens. Culture, creativity, and individuality was missing. Oh, sorry. In the article, Why is the Serious Landscape Architect?, scholars Thomas Olds and Phoebe Likwar comment that we are on our way to become a buzzkill profession, groaning under the burden to repair, reconnect, reclaim, restore, regenerate, and revitalize. We see this firsthand in our teaching, where students no longer have any sense of discovery, creativity, or curiosity, instead viewing design as a problem to be addressed through prescribed set outcomes. Our moral weight circulating the profession appears to be paralyzing a new generation of landscape practitioners. Of course, landscape architecture must respond to our global challenging times. But what puzzles us is why design is not being viewed as a critical part of the answer, unlike in other design professions. History shows that design has major impact in times of crisis. For example, in the 1960s, a group of 7 young, ambitious Japanese architects, industrial designers, graphic designers, known as the Metabolist, developed a manifesto and design exploration in response to Japan's devastation and destruction following World War II. The design collective viewed this moment as an opportunity for rebuilding the nation and transitioning from an agrarian to an information society through a new urbanism grounded in technology and collective consumerism. Architecture in cities were reconceived as organic, growing through metabolic processes of change and renewal, with new forms of living and fabrication proposed. The Singaporean-based practice salad dressing offers a contemporary landscape architecture example, demonstrating how theoretical ideas of rewilding can produce space of wonder and delight while addressing serious issues of water quality and biodiversity. Practice founder Huayan Chang laments on the number of landscape architects who are focused on problem solving, for example, applying technical solutions for the capturing and cleansing of water. While solving problems is not inherently a bad thing, it is the replication of solution that is a major issue for him. He exclaims, "What is the role for landscape architects if we just copy and replicate solutions? Being a designer is becoming a rare thing." Salad dressing is particularly interested in the potentials of the post-human future, where hierarchical biases are dissolved and the world is co-created between humans, animals, and plants. They describe this relationship through a ratio of 33, 33, 33, 1, where 33 is for other living beings, 33 for digital beings, 33 for human beings, and 1% for the abstract, for the untamed imagination to happen. Their design for hotel in tropical Borneo offers a compelling example of how these ideas can drive a commercial project. Facing the sea with the mountain backdrop, the 230-meter-long hotel creates a series of distinct microclimates with a monsoonal climate. Connectivity drives everything in this design. The facade is blanketed green with droppers of climbers and climbing, connecting ground to the sky. Ficus trees, a keystone species, burst from the facade and sends down their area roots. Birds and terrestrial animals, like palm civets, come to enjoy the fruit and exchange nutrient and microorganisms. After rain, residual water from the building is directed through the topography in a series of ponds and phytoremediation plants, connecting into the floodplain. The water is cleansed of silt and nutrients before it reaches the sea. An animal-friendly lighting concept protects these nocturnal friends. In addition, there are explicit cultural connections shaped by design philosophy of immateriality. Sun paths are calculated in form of sunset in a series of pavilions according to special days like Earth Day, Labor Day, Mangrove Day, Children's Day, Christmas, and Valentine's Day, along with the client's birthday. An eco-playground offers a variety of fruit trees to share with animals and features a house for the bats, who are important pollinators in the surrounding mangrove forests. Their design for enabling village in Singapore offers a more urban example of their rewilding philosophy. Working with architects Wohar, a public housing estate from the 1970s was repurposed as an intense space that integrates education, work, training, retail, and lifestyle, connecting people with disabilities and the society. The landscape is curated in an immense tropical forest garden, featuring an extensive water system that interweaves amongst the architecture and walkways to offer a kampong feel. Operating through a phytoremediation process, the system stores excess water during the monsoon wet and provides moisture during hotter months. Buildings are oriented to major ponds, while verandas extend out onto outdoor spaces and frame views of the dense tropical forest. The use of natural succession and native species allows plants to mature, evolve, and adapt. Over 75% of the 170 different plant species are endemic to the region. Over time, the layering composition of the biodiverse planting has intensified, with each part of the composition gaining equal status. Like Henri Mousseau's painting, The Dream, the absence of depth in midst of greens presents a peculiar chaos that lacks hierarchy and gives a sense of calmness. So, reflecting on this, how should we address the homogenization status of the profession as observed by Takano? In the second part of our talk, Jilian will draw on our experience conceptualizing the Big Asian Book of Landscape Architecture through framings of interreferencing, to demonstrate how grounding design within specific cultural contexts can revitalize practice. Importantly, the interreferencing of design practice within similar cultural context escapes the generalization inherent in nationalism and globalization to reveal specific processes, theories, and philosophies influential in design. But first, Jilian will begin by explaining why we felt the need to develop the Big Asian Book of Landscape Architecture.
Thank you, Heike. So as academics working in Australia, we were growing uncomfortable teaching students from Asia with Western material. We felt the need to uncover the cultural complexity of design in the region, which was increasingly being conceived relative to North American or European perspectives. We were motivated to address this gap through our experience editing a themed edition of the journal Landscape Architecture Australia, entitled Embracing the Asian Century. Published in early 2018, this edition explored ideas and trends relevant to Australia's relationship to Asia, and this experience encouraged us to pursue a larger book project. At a 20-minute chance meeting with Congen Yu in Melbourne, we declared our intention, along with a desire to run a workshop in Asia. However, we didn't have any money. We generally don't have any money. Generously, Congen offered to host a 2-day workshop in Beijing, which was planned for January 2019. We set about inviting a practitioner and academic from different Asian contexts to attend what became known as the Big Asian Book Workshop. To some participants, we were unknown, so travelling to a self-funded workshop was a generous leap of faith. This workshop would be critical to establishing the book's conceptual framing, along with our own credibility, given we were operating from Australia, which is both part and distant to the region. Within an Asian context, relationships are everything, and given the cultural and political complexity of Asia, we did not want to offend or overreach. But at the same time, it was necessary to challenge Asian academics and designers to be specific in articulating their practice. Acknowledging our own Western bias, we went into the workshop without any preconceived ideas for a book structure, beyond the fact that it would not be a national catalogue of projects. We carefully designed a series of explorations, presentations and activities which we hoped would allow themes and concepts to surface. For example, at our welcome dinner, we handed out world maps and asked participants to delineate what they considered the boundaries of this place called Asia. The debates that emerged around the table confirmed the elastic nature of this term. Day one was full of short presentations from participants who were invited to discuss landscape architecture from their own cultural perspective, along with lots of informal chats over food and smoke breaks. On the second day, we divided people into groups of different Asian backgrounds and ran 2 activities. Before the workshop, we asked everyone to nominate 3 influential contemporary Asian projects. 2 could be from their own practice, and the third more broadly from the region. We printed these projects onto cards and then asked the groups to discuss and cluster without relying on typical classifications such as Western typologies or scale. At first, this activity stumped participants, demonstrating just how indoctrinated we are in viewing design practice in a particular way. And then the ideas started to flow. A second session explored the diverse terminologies and concepts related to landscape in different languages. This exercise revealed cultural lineages and overlaps, along with the presence of disruptive forces such as colonisation. The methods used to structure the workshop and subsequently our book are aligned with the concept of interreferencing, or Asia as method. So what do we mean by interreferencing? In a 1960 lecture, Japanese philosopher Yoshimi Takeuchi advocated breaking from binary framing such as progress and tradition, or the East and the West. Agonizing over Japan's role during World War II, he argued that it was unproductive to turn to Europe or North America for explanations of why Japanese history had gone astray. While Asia's intellectual elite, in their pursuit of modernization, tried to emulate the West, Takeuchi reflected on the hierarchical relationship between the West and Asia, resulting from different stages of modernization. He observed that if one went to Europe or the United States, there would be a sense that the people there are superior or better than oneself. Instead, he suggested interreferencing places that share similar historical experiences to produce grounded knowledge. This idea of interreferencing, also known as Asia's method, offers a concrete intellectual agenda that enables research to be placed in its specific historical context without the epistemological and ontological burden of catching up with the West. Takeuchi argues that Asianism is not an objective concept or one that can be narrativized into a single trend of thought. Instead, he describes Asianism as a mood or an inclination. Our workshop exercises actively negated nationalistic framings and Western typologies to reveal culturally specific knowledges and practices. They acted as a catalyst for a group of established designers with a sprinkling of academics to discuss similarities and differences that were unfolding. Two things quickly became apparent: just how little time practice gets to talk to each other about ideas rather than clients, and that participants were not aware of each other's work, which reinforced the need for the book. Reflecting on the Beijing workshop and the concept of interreferencing, we adopted the tripartite structure of continuum, interruption, and speed for our book. We view these as critical characteristics or moods for building a picture of what it means to design, do business, and think about nature, space, and urbanism with an Asian sensibility. There's no hierarchy to these three characteristics, which simultaneously influence an Asian practice. Hence, our readers can start with any section. Continuum establishes some of the shared cultural and philosophical understandings of space, time, and nature that cross the Asian region and explores how these are interpreted within contemporary design practice. While the discipline of landscape architecture is new in Asia, this knowledge is centuries old. Interruption explores the impact of modernity and the economic growth on Asia. Urbanization, shaped by complex relationships between government, developers, international and local investment, and citizens, underpins the introduction of new open space typologies, along with the emergence of landscape architecture as a profession. Speed examines how governments and designers respond to the boom-bust cycles of economic development, the imbalance of rural and urban processes, and the density of the Asian city. Rather than viewed as a hindrance, speed can be considered a mechanism for innovation and change. I will now offer just a few examples of the design knowledge that emerged as part of the writing and research process. As part of Continuum, we invited designers from the bamboo civilizations of Korea, Japan, and China to critically reflect on how they negotiate a world of continuity and interruption in their own practice. Park Kim, who you've just heard from, highlighted the potentials of the cultural concept of Sansu, which is shared across East Asia to guide future Asian landscape practice in an era of global environmental crisis. Literally translating as mountain and water, this composite term roughly equates to landscape, but has a much deeper conceptual and visual differentiation, denoting the polarity of mountain and water. Park Kim looks to the spirit of Sansu to explore new paradigms for form, space, and climatic responses to insert within Seoul's chaotic modernism. For example, their scheme for Yanghwa riverfront was conceived in the spirit of Sansu. A close collaboration with hydraulic engineers helped Park Kim address major issues of tidal mud and flooding, while also revisiting the cultural relationships between topography and water, which shaped the 17th century Korean peninsula. The resulting park successfully establishes a new spatial and ecological relationship between water and land, people, and the Han River. Z&T, who unfortunately are not here today, is inspired by the miniature landscapes of classical Chinese garden design and their possibilities for bringing an experience of wilderness into the city. They don't attempt to literally rebuild nature, but instead design for an experience of nature expressed creatively through phenomena and attributes such as sunlight, fog, rain, creeks, waterfalls, woods, and meadows. These fragments of nature have a deep cultural meaning. For example, water is a symbol of wisdom in Chinese culture, indicating how to work around obstacles and find ways to the destination. Z&T's Yuyun courtyard in Suzhou draws on these influences to build a connection between the new and old, borrowing the spirit of meandering water and reinterpreting it through modern design language. The creek references a story from the Jin dynasty, which tells of a group of artists and poets gathered to have a party along a creek. They dropped a wine cup in the water flow, and whenever the cup stopped, someone would drink and make a poem. When filled with water, the creek becomes a curved, reflective pool, mirroring the building, sky, cloud, and moon in a meandering frame. The design is a careful balance of simplicity and complexity and reinterprets traditional craftsmanship with modern technology such as digital fabrication. We can see in these two projects just how inadequate the binary terms of tradition and modern are in describing Asian practice. Instead, Park Him and Z&T demonstrate skills and confidence in reinterpreting cultural stories and philosophies into designs relevant to the contemporary Asian city. Turning to the section on interruption, the discussion uncovers a diversity of urban spaces emerging in the dense Asian city, including innovative new typologies. Publicness defies clear definition in Asia. In the world's densest cities, the ideas of laying down a clearly delineated public park as conceived within a Western context is an impossibility. Instead, developers with their eyes on commercial and cultural trends are mixing living and working to create new urban typologies. These projects are of international relevance for both their design possibilities and their investment model, which brings responsibility for community, place, and the city into the private financial realm. For example, Singapore-based developer CapitaLand is one of Asia's largest and most innovative mall developers. Their 2019 remodelling of Funan in downtown Singapore explores the potential of a phygital mall, blending elements of living, working, and shopping along with a smart technology to create a new lifestyle concept. Spread throughout Funan are significant investments in open space and recreational activities, including a 3-storey climbing wall and a large rooftop urban farm. In a major change to the internally focused shopping mall, Funan has been designed to connect to the city. Cyclists can ride directly through the mall. Nihonbashi Garden in Tokyo offers a further commercial example, located on the roof of Mitsukoshi, which is the flagship of Japan's oldest surviving chain of department stores, first established in 1673. 33 metres above the busy streets, Landscape Plus designed a contemporary interpretation of a strolling pond garden. Drawing on the traditional Japanese concept of nature, where the garden and the home are at one, a large gabled open roof structure looks out over a reflective pond and native vegetation. In parallel to these commercially driven models of publicness, across Asia, different ensembles of citizens, civil society groups, professionals, universities, and government institutions are involved in community building and collaborative governance. There is a tendency in Western discourse to describe such practices under the generalised terms of bottom-up or placemaking. However, these terminologies do not adequately reflect the role that these landscape-driven processes have in shifting state-society relationships in the region into more civic-orientated societies. In some cases, designers are operating as activists. For example, the Thai landscape architect Shma used Bangkok Design Week to draw attention to the absence of green space in Bangkok, which is less than 6 square metres per person. They built a floating park on an ordinary sand barge to house a learning playground for children, a mini-urban farm, and art installations. While these projects share a common agenda of creating publicly orientated space in the dense city, they are responding to economic, social, and political forces in a variety of innovative ways. The innovation of these projects is lost when we subsume them into generalities of public, private, civic, bottom-up or top-down. Finally, to the speed section, which reveals the slow and fast design practices that have emerged in response to processes of urbanisation. Many of these ideas draw on cultural practices and philosophies introduced in continuum, while others work at the edge of new technologies and materiality. Rather than viewed as a hindrance, speed can be considered a catalyst for new design practice as Asian societies transition into the next phase of economic development. Discussions about landscape and health in the wider global discourse tend to be instrumental and pragmatic, but within the contemporary Asian context, the restorative qualities of being in nature are tied into ancient cosmological and religious conceptualizations of the world, in which humans are an intrinsic part of nature. However, the environmental degradation associated with rapid urbanization and the rise of megacities exposes contradictions around Asian philosophies based on living in harmony with nature. Many projects are reconnecting urban populations to a rural experience and the restorative value of nature. In rural areas Southeast Asia, restoration is driven by community activism, for example, or activation. For example, in Thailand, forest-dwelling monks engage in community development, forest ecology, and indigenous knowledge systems. In contrast, the stronger economies of Japan, China, Korea, and Singapore have generated a demand for eco-spa and forest tourism. These are popular with urbanites who wish to temporarily escape the pressures of the city and enjoy the restorative qualities of the rural countryside. This has provided opportunities for landscape architects to work with developers such as the Japanese-based Hoshinoya Resorts to explore contemporary design practices of restoration. The Hoshino family have been operating in the resort business for over 100 years. There are now 6 resorts in Japan, Indonesia, and Taiwan. Each resort is designed with a simple aspiration to reveal the hidden characteristics, distinct experiences, and specific culture of the location. Staying in Japan, other strategies for rural revitalisation centre on the explicit improvement of health and well-being, especially in remote forested areas that have suffered from declining forest industry. The concept of forest bathing first occurred in the 1980s as part of the government's healthcare plan to manage the effects of stress related to urban life, such as hypertension in the elderly population. In 2005, Okutama Council became one of Japan's first government-certified forest therapy bases. They commissioned Studio On-Site to develop a therapy trail in collaboration with Chiba University. Instead of a simple walking track, the 1.3-kilometre trail is interpreted as a linear living room along the hillside forest. A series of seating areas, follies and decks provide the chance to spend more time in the slowly restored forest. Designed to rest the body in various positions, the stops shift attention to the sounds and the changing light conditions in the area. All of the projects discussed today offer just a glimpse of the extraordinary ideas and designs that emerged during the process of developing the Big Asian Book. Working with the comparative contextualization provided by interreferencing, we were able to develop a more nuanced understanding of the diversity of practice in Asia, along with a greater sense of the agency of design. Returning to Takano's observation that young designers in Asia are growing up with a sense of a Western-style landscape, what can we do? As we have suggested today, the domination of particular worldviews in how we practice and how the profession is being framed and disseminated is leading to the perception of homogenization. We would like to conclude with 2 suggestions for moving forward. First, let's look to the ideas of interreferencing to develop a greater understanding of the diversity and complexity of practice. This is particularly important in places where the profession is less developed. It's time to be wary of the international expert and taking on values and ideas from places of little relevance. Having a global mandate for the profession and education is not necessarily a good thing. Second, let's liberate academics from their research institutions and put them to work helping practice to understand and document the ideas, processes, and innovation. Currently, practice and academia are operating in parallel worlds. Much work needs to be done in supporting practice who do not have the time to be reflective in the fast-paced commercial world. We don't mean to send academics out to do post-occupancy evaluations or to measure things. Instead, we encourage academics to think critically about design and collaborate with practice to reveal more complex and specific stories. If we focus on these 2 points, before you know it, we'll start to have a very different conversation about landscape architecture. Design will regain its deserved role, understood as a cultural critical practice. Landscape architecture will more confidently take its place next to architecture as a diverse, complex, and innovative design practice. And a new generation of landscape architects will escape their passive, problem-solving pessimism, it's a lot of P's, to understand the multiple ways that design can make a difference in today's complex world. Thank you for the opportunity to share our thoughts. Go out and buy the book. It's gold.